Well, to the G7 summit in southern Italy now. This is where the world's top industrial and democratic countries are gathering this week, addressing a number of issues that include the conflict in Gaza, climate change, and artificial intelligence. But on this, the first day of this year's gathering, it was Ukraine that took center stage, and a $50 billion loan from the G7 countries. Money that is backed by Russian assets seized by the Western partners as punishment for the Kremlin's illegal invasion of Ukraine.
For many, many years, we've been talking about the need to go after some of the Russian assets and the Russian profits particularly, and the fact that we came to a consensus today on $50 billion worth of direct support for Ukraine, that the G7 and allies are going to be backstopping. Canada is actually the first country to announce $5 billion of that will be a Canadian contribution, because we know how important it is to make sure you have the tools to continue to defend not just your country, but all of our democracies and the principles of the rules-based order.
Of course, you are right about the assets. This question was on the table from the very beginning of the war, but you've been the first country who began to move it. Thank you for your loud voice. And for today, we are very close for this decision about $50 billion. They will help Ukraine not only on the battlefield, also in reconstruction. Thank you so much.
Well, to talk about the G7, we're now joined by John Kirton. He's a professor at the University of Toronto, also the director of the G7 Research Group. John Kirton, thank you for joining us this evening.
Well, good to be with you and your viewers.
So, of course, Canada is there in southern Italy, along with other Western leaders. Can you talk to us about the goals as Canada sees it this time around as the G7 meets?
Well, Justin Trudeau came into this summit with 5 clear goals, which he outlined in his article in the Summit Background book. The first was to lead on the clean energy transition, which, of course, covers both climate change and energy security, a key priority here at Apulia. The second was combating misinformation and disinformation, which includes election interference, which is, of course, a top-line current preoccupation of those in Parliament, on Parliament Hill, and indeed Canadians across the land. He also included artificial intelligence, which is another priority here at Apulia. Pope Francis is coming in to lead the discussion on that tomorrow. But it was Justin Trudeau who really invented the global governance of artificial intelligence when he hosted the Charlevoix G7 summit back in 2018. So he's been a leader on that one for some time. The final one, understandably, is to use the Apulia summit to set up the building blocks on what his priorities will be for the summit that Canada, and he assumes he, will host next year in 2025.
That's right, and it will be Canada hosting it. Whether or not there's an election before that is something we're going to have to watch and see. But, you know, those are the goals that Canada has set. But already, as this summit takes off, we know that one accomplishment has to do with Ukraine, because the G7 leaders have agreed to extend this $50 billion loan to Ukraine, backed by the interest that is raised from seized Russian assets. Without a doubt, a significant deal for Ukraine. But how important is that deal for the G7?
Oh, I think it's fundamentally important because I think everyone knows, from Mr. Putin in the Kremlin to President Zelensky of Ukraine, who led off the G7 discussions amongst the leaders here today, that unless the G7 can get its act together and support Ukraine and sanction Russia in ways that win the war for Ukraine in the democratic world, there's really nowhere else to go. Not the UN Security Council, not the G20. So they are the frontline global governance group, and they sure hit a home run today with the $50 billion deal what was, I think, important about it was not just that they reached the biggest figure, 50 billion, but it came not just from a loan against future interest on the Russian assets that were seized from the EU or the US. That was the debate up until a few days ago. It came from all of the G7 members, and Canada was the first to announce publicly how much it would provide, 5 billion of the 50 billion. That's 10%, even though Canada's share of the G7 economy is only about half of that. So Canada's doing twice as much as its fair share. Yet again, it's really leading the G7 on Ukraine.
Yeah, so something to note in terms of the contribution Canada's making in terms of commitment. I also want to talk about the dynamics of this gathering, because of course the Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, she's hosting the G7. Arguably, she is the only G7 leader who comes into the summit with a position of strength. She's the leader of a far-right party. The far-right parties did well in the recent European elections. How will that affect discussions around the table when many of the other G7 leaders are, like Justin Trudeau, on shakier ground?
It does matter, and in some cases it'll be a constraint on a few issues. But all the leaders know, as the polls come in the United States, that actually Joe Biden is back. Ever since his opponent became a convicted felon, Trump has been declining in the polls. Biden has been rising. He's now got a plurality in most of the ones that count. And with the latest figures on the inflation rate in the United States, 0 in May, if indeed it is, to quote an American pundit, the economy's stupid, that's now Biden who's really delivering the goods on that. Some of the other leaders, Macron will certainly be there, however, as legislative elections go. And if the G7 loses Rishi Sunak, the British Prime Minister, when they go to the polls on July 4th, well, they'll get Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour Party leader, who actually is more supportive of many of the G7 priorities here than Rishi Sunak was. So it's not a one-way street. And even if they think, as they've had to, oh my goodness, it might be a Donald Trump after the inauguration of the US president next January, they're trying to do deals here that will be Trump-proof. And we certainly saw that in the $50 billion package, all of which is designed to be delivered to Ukraine, the money, by the end of this year, before the inauguration. And we've also seen it in another big advance, the bilateral security agreement between Biden and Zelensky, an agreement designed to last 10 years and done in ways that makes it as politically bulletproof within the USA and its Congress as one can do these days.
Well, certainly a lot to watch as the G7 meets. John Kirton, thank you for this. Appreciate the insight tonight.
Okay, glad to be with you.